fraction is a numerical assessment on the analytically approximated criterion for fracture initiation from perforated horizontal wells I presented earlier. The motivation for this study, after in a series of experiments I performed during my master's degree in highly concentrated gelatin, I kept observing longitudinal fracture initiation while I expected to see transverse. And another student before me had the same issues in his experiment in hydrostone cement experiments. So I decided to take a deeper look into this topic. This is the chronological series of the literature milestones for this topic. In 1957, Hubbard and Willis very famously conclude that the final propagation plane of fractures is always perpendicular to the smaller stress in what is known as the preferred fracture plane, or PFP, that I mentioned earlier. Then there was a number of scientists who performed experiments in horizontal wells observing transverse fractures only through the reorientation of what was originally longitudinal fracture initiation. This led to them starting to believe that this could be a universal fact about horizontal wells. However, in 1989, El Raba proved them wrong because he managed to achieve transverse fracture initiation in his high-stress cement block experiments using motor oil as the fracturing fluid. This brings us to today, 2020. Having this literature review in mind, the question we should ask ourselves is what really governs the orientation of fracture initiation, and how accurate and valid are the criteria I presented in the previous section. Going back to the previous section, for perforated wells, I mentioned 3 orientation criteria, which are all shown in this allowable stress state diagram. The simplest one is Hossein's from 2000, which is also the most conservative and is indicated by the dashed dotted line, the cyan dashed dotted line. The green line is common for all 3. Then we have the modified version, which incorporates static pore pressure from 2018, which is shown using the dotted cyan line, which imposed a big shift compared to the Hossein original criterion. Then we have the second modified version from 2019, which incorporates fluid infiltration from the wellbore, and is shown by the solid cyan line. As we see, the difference between the dotted and solid cyan lines is minor, which suggests that now moving towards a computational numerical analysis, we can use the modification which incorporates only static pore pressure and ignore fluid infiltration from the wellbore. This will help us in regards to our computational analysis, which I will discuss next, numerical analysis. Make no mistake, the Kirsch solutions are purely two-dimensional, which Hossein uses in a very smart way. He applies the two-dimensional solution twice in order to approximate a three-dimensional problem. Nevertheless, the expressions he derived for the 2 fracturing stresses are not analytically exact. That is why we refer to them as approximations. So I thought it would be wise to build a numerical model to assess the validity of the orientation criterion I developed using those approximations. I did that in FLAG 3D, which is a finite volume simulator for geomechanics-based problems by Itasca. And as we see here, I used a 1/8 block model. We have the cylindrical wellbore going through, intersected by the smaller but also cylindrical perforation. Both cavities are pressurized at the same pressure. The block is loaded with the in situ stresses, and a point far away from the perforation is chosen for verification purposes. The reason being is that at this point, all perforation effects are diminished, and the stress field can be calculated analytically for an exact solution. Therefore, I can use the numerical model to calculate the stress state at this point and see how well it matches the exact analytical solutions. We do that to build confidence in our model. We basically ask the model a question for which we know the answer, so that when we ask it a question for which we don't know the answer, which in this case is to calculate the stress state at our point of interest, which is the perforation base, we'll be confident that what the model is telling us is the right thing. After verifying the model, I used it to calculate the true three-dimensional numerical solutions for a case study performed on parameters from the Barnett Shale in Texas. On the plot here, I have the numerical solutions using points, red for longitudinal, blue for transverse fracturing stress, and with the solid lines, we have the corresponding Hossein approximations modified to incorporate static pressure. Clearly, there is very poor matching between the two solutions. The biggest discrepancy, or error if you will, occurs with the blue transverse fracturing stress, which seems to be dependent on wellbore pressure in a way that it becomes more compressive as wellbore pressure increases. This has significant implications on the breakdown pressure window concept I mentioned earlier, which is originally expected to be from 0 all the way to this point here. Now it's restricted to this narrow yellow shaded region, less than 50% of the original expectation. Additionally, because of the positive slope of this transverse fracturing stress, we now have a second constraint to transverse fracture initiation besides the breakdown pressure window, and that is the y-intercept of this blue transverse fracturing stress trend indicates what I call the critical tensile strength. If the formation you are trying to fracture has tensile strength higher than this value, there would be no fracture initiation. You cannot get that no matter what the breakdown pressure value is. This critical tensile strength constraint is different than the breakdown pressure window in that there is almost nothing the practitioner from the surface can do that can influence the magnitude of the tensile stress downhole. For instance, the only experimentalists in laboratory studies using synthetic materials may have some impact on the tensile strength property of the material they are trying to fracture. We attribute this weakness of the Hossein approximations to the fact that it does not take into account the interaction between the radial stress around the wellbore and the radial stress around the perforation. The way those two radial stresses mutually interact alters the magnitude of the stresses on the wellbore radius, which in turn affects the tangential stress on the perforation base from which the two fracturing stresses are being calculated. Following that, I expanded my simulation over a range of stress states for a fixed wellbore pressure, 0.6 psi per foot. On the left, we have the orientation criterion developed using the Hossein approximations, modified for pore pressure. When we compare this with the true three-dimensional solution on the right, we see that the blue region is much smaller and narrower than what the Hossein approximations originally suggest. This highlights the extent to which the Hossein approximations over-exaggerate transverse fracture initiation. And what is very interesting about this plot on the right-hand side, which I built point by point, simulation by simulation, is the fact that it does an excellent job predicting the results from laboratory studies from the literature where either longitudinal or transverse fracture initiation had been observed. The true three-dimensional numerical model is then applied on the 7 shale plays I mentioned in the first section. The longitudinal and transverse fracturing stresses were calculated as a function of the wellbore pressure. Then breakdown pressures from the literature were used for making a prediction for the orientation of fracture initiation in each plane. Out of the 7 shale play studies, only for one, the Barnett Shale in Texas, our model predicts transverse fracture initiation. On all other 6 plays, longitudinal fracture initiation is predicted, which implies that reorientation and fluid tortuosities must be hindering post-stimulation well performance. In conclusion, the approximated criterion for fracture initiation from perforated wells was numerically assessed and found to overestimate transverse fracture initiation. Transverse fracture initiation is a rarity, which occurs under a narrow range of conditions pertaining to low breakdown pressure and tensile strength. Fracture reorientation is something that appears to be happening a lot in the oil field, with 6 out of 7 shale play studies using the numerical model expected to yield longitudinal fracture initiation.